Hey everyone, and welcome back to the San Francisco Wine Trading Company. I'm Jason, and today I figured I'll talk about a spirit with possibly more history than any other spirit out there. Of course, I'm talking about gin. And what is gin? Well, gin is essentially flavored vodka. There, I said okay. I'll even go as far as vodka is probably unfinished gin. I guess let the comments and debate go on, but essentially it's kind of correct. Both vodka and gin starts off as neutral grain spirits, and of course gin is followed up by flavoring with botanicals. But in order to actually understand gin and what it is and where it came from, we actually have to go way back, possibly to the 1550s, well, AD.
Well, what I really meant to say was BC, ancient times. Back when Egyptian time and ancient history. But we have to talk about the juniper berries. And through that time, people discovered that juniper berries was actually utilized as medicine. It kind of cured any ailments from respiratory symptoms to performance enhancing abilities. Well, anyways, it stuck with people, and people started utilizing the juniper berries and soaking them into their alcohol, namely wine, at that time, especially in the 1st century, as the Roman Empire kind of produced a lot more wine and it was readily available for people, and that's when people actually dumped in the juniper berries into their alcohol as medicine. Fast forward a few centuries here to the 16th century or 1500s, technology allowed for distillation with the pot still, and the Dutch actually kind of not perfected it, but utilized all that technology to make their version with juniper berries, and they called it Genever or Genever Gin. Genever being the Dutch word for juniper berries, and it kind of stuck. Here, example here. The Bols Genever from Amsterdam is, of course, the modern take. Back then, the Genever, they needed a lot of juniper berries and a lot of botanicals to actually kind of cover up the harshness. It was a single distillate from a pot still utilizing malt wine or beer. Of course, modern day takes on it still has the malt wine as the base, so that just think of like almost whiskey-esque kind of flavors, but of course it's much more mellow. Still has a lot of juniper, but this Bols Genever Gin in particular has a lot of apricots and stone fruits kind of characteristics in it as well. Speaking to my whiskey lovers, this was possibly the precursor, quote-unquote, old-fashioned cocktail spirit used before whiskey. So take that into account. All right. Now, of course, with the Dutch producing their Genever Gin, everybody actually really liked it, especially in England. And in the 1600s to the 1700s, there was actually a gin craze in England. So much so, government officials didn't really do any taxation on it and actually allowed people to make their own gin. From poor to rich, it was their choice. And of course, as long as it has juniper, it could be called gin. Since the no taxation, it actually gave way that beer was more expensive than gin. So a pint of beer was more expensive to purchase than a pint of gin. So again, people started buying more gin. And as you can see in society, a pint of gin with every meal could have side effects. Yeah, and that's what happened. So much so that a lot of shady characters started popping up, trying to make a quick buck. And so-called the Bathtub Gin started to give rise. people started to make crude forms of distillates, a lot of methylated alcohol, which is essentially poisonous to any human, and people covered up the flavoring from sawdust to like other poisons out there. And because of that crude nature and less than appropriate quality, people started to add licorice roots and sugars and honeys into the bathtub gin to try to mask up the flavors, and thus born the Old Tom gin style. Now, it wasn't until mid 1700s, 1751 to be exact, as British officials started to say to themselves that allowing the mass majority to freely produce gins and drink gin whenever they wanted was a downfall of their society. So they actually passed a law called the Gin Act to actually reduce and limit the amount of consumption for the public. And of course, with anything that the government wants to limit the people on, they did it through taxation. They taxed the retail shops, and thus was born the notorious Old Tom Gin cat sign that was hung up on buildings to let people know that illegal gin was sold here. Of course, jump into modern day technologies and ethics. Old Tom Gin still exists. Here we have the Ransom Old Tom Gin, produced in a way following the old ways, but of course with legality and quality. Still utilizes the neutral grain spirits at this time, still flavored with licorice roots, and the coloration on the Ransom is actually barrel aged, kind of reflecting how in the 1800s bartenders would actually keep their gins in barrels and will extract some of that flavor from the barrels itself. Perfect for a Negroni or even the Martinez. Just think of it as the gin version of Manhattan. Absolutely delicious. All right, and of course, going through a few more years, in 1830s, there was a French-born Irish scientist named Anais Coffee, which invented the coffee still. Essentially, this changed the face of the spirits world, as this coffee still allowed the distillate to actually distill continuously as long as the beer, wine, wort was continuously fed into the still itself. Now, it produced a very, very clear and neutral spirit, and this coinciding with the new gin basket, kind of like a bulbous pot on top of this still, allowed people to actually add in the botanicals, the juniper berries, the peels into the still itself, and you have what is now called London Dry Gin, that kind of style. Ooh. Now, just to let you know, the London Dry style is a style and not a place of origin, so it doesn't have that London Dry Gin doesn't have to be produced in London or in England to be exact. But an example of this very great producer is the Sipsmith London Dry Gin. All right, the flavor profiles of London Dry could range in a way, but typically London Dry styles would always have that juniper flavor profile, a little bit of citrus as well, sometimes a little pepperiness. Of course, that's usually what it falls in the realms of. Perfect for your gin and tonics, as that citrus notes and the juniper really plays well with the quinine in your tonic water. All right. Now, modern day, because mixology, cocktails, bartenders are now putting their stamp in the cocktail world, a lot of new styles of gin has popped up. A lot of people might not like that super juniper kind of kick, so they actually produced a new style of gin, whether to showcase the terroir, quote unquote, of the land of where the botanicals came from, or they produced a gin that has a certain flavor profile to make a better cocktail. An example of this would be this gin mar, all right, coming from Spain, and it utilizes olives, thyme, rosemary, and basil. So you could imagine that it'll have a little bit of that saltiness and oiliness of that olive, but also the herbaceousness of all those herbs. Plays really, really well in a martini, especially the dirty martini. It'll just amplify that little saline kick of that olive and olive juice. Makes one hell of a martini. All right, another example would be this Grace Gin coming from Greece. It utilizes rock sapphire, orange blossoms, and myrrh. Myrrh. You know, like frankincense and myrrh, that spice. And what I get from this, of course, is that orange blossom notes, but also a little bit of spiciness, almost Szechuan peppercornish. And I think this would be great in a French 75 cocktail as well. All right, and of course, there you have it, a very, very quick crash course on the history of gins and the different styles. Of course, gin could be utilized for your holiday as the spirit of choice for many, many different cocktails, and it'll be great with food as well. With all these episodes, again, don't forget to click the links below and the descriptions below for your chance to sample them yourself. We'll put it on sale for a limited time. If you're more interested in the history of gin, I'll put some resources down at the description area as well. And of course, don't forget to hit that like button and of course subscribe for future episodes. All right, here's to ya. Cheers.